The lonely lighthouse keeper who waited 40 years. The night had settled gently over the sea. The sky stretched endlessly above, painted in deep shades of midnight blue, where countless stars shimmered like tiny lanterns. Below them, the ocean moved with slow, patient waves, each one rolling softly toward the rocky shore before quietly disappearing into the darkness. There was no hurry here, no loud voices, no crowded streets, only the comforting rhythm of the sea and the distant call of a single seabird drifting through the cool night air. On the highest cliff overlooking the ocean stood an old lighthouse. For more than a century, it had watched over these waters without missing a single night. Storms had crashed against its stone walls. Thick fog had hidden the sea for days at a time. Winters had covered the cliffs with ice, and summers had filled the air with the scent of salt and wild flowers. Yet the lighthouse had remained. Every evening, just before sunset, its great lantern came alive, sending a warm golden beam across the endless ocean. Inside that lighthouse lived an old man named Elias. His beard had turned silver many years ago, and deep lines rested gently across his face. They were not the marks of sadness but of time itself. Years spent watching the sea, listening to the wind, and caring for a light that guided strangers safely home. His mornings were quiet. He would wake before sunrise, prepare a simple breakfast of warm bread and tea, and sit beside the eastern window as the first rays of sunlight touched the water. After breakfast, he swept the wooden floors, polished the brass railings, checked every window, and climbed the long spiral staircase to inspect the giant glass lens above. Each movement was slow, careful, almost peaceful enough to become a kind of meditation. Visitors often wondered how anyone could live alone for so many years. Some believed Elias enjoyed the silence. Others thought he had simply forgotten what life beyond the lighthouse looked like. But none of those guesses were true. The truth was something only the sea seemed to remember. Each evening, just before lighting the lantern, Elias would walk outside to the edge of the cliff. He would stand there without speaking. His eyes searched the horizon where the sky met the ocean. Always the same place. Always the same quiet expression. As though he expected someone to appear from beyond the darkness. The fishermen from the nearby village had noticed this ritual for decades. When they were children, they had asked him what he was waiting for. He always answered with the same gentle smile. "I'm still waiting. Nothing more. No explanation. No story." Only those three simple words. Years became decades. Children grew into parents. Parents became grandparents. Still, the old lighthouse keeper waited. The villagers eventually stopped asking. Some said he was waiting for a ship that had disappeared long ago. Others whispered about a promise made beneath the stars. A few believed he waited for someone he loved. No one truly knew. Even the oldest people in the village admitted that the mystery had existed for longer than they could remember. Yet every evening, as the lighthouse awakened and its warm light slowly turned across the sea, they felt comforted. If Elias was still there, if the light still shone, then perhaps everything in the world was exactly as it should be. Tonight felt different. The wind carried the scent of approaching rain, though no clouds covered the stars. The waves were strangely gentle, almost as if they wished not to disturb the silence. Far beyond the horizon, hidden where no eye could see, something had begun to move. Not a storm, not danger, but a journey, one that had taken 40 years to begin. Elias did not know it yet. He climbed the spiral staircase one careful step at a time, carrying the small lantern in his weathered hand. At the very top, he cleaned the great crystal lens until it sparkled like frozen sunlight. Then, with practiced hands, he lit the great beacon. The golden light slowly awakened. It turned across the dark ocean. Once, twice, again and again. Somewhere beyond that light, someone was finally coming home. The lonely lighthouse keeper who waited 40 years. Part 2. The promise beneath the stars. The lighthouse continued its slow and faithful circle. Its golden beam glided gently across the quiet sea, touching the waves for only a moment before moving on again. Inside the lantern room, Elias stood in silence, listening. Not for footsteps, not for voices, but for the sound the sea sometimes made on very special nights. After so many years, he believed the ocean had its own language. Most people heard only waves. Elias heard memories. As the night grew deeper, he placed another piece of wood into the small iron stove. The room filled with gentle warmth, and the soft crackling of the fire blended perfectly with the distant rhythm of the water below. He poured himself a cup of warm tea. Steam rose slowly into the air. On the wooden table beside him rested an old leather journal. Its cover was faded. Its corners were worn smooth by time. Carefully, Elias opened it. Inside were hundreds of pages filled with neat handwriting. Every page carried the same date. Every year, for 40 years. The first page had been written on a spring evening long ago. Tonight, she asked me to keep the light burning until she returned. Elias smiled softly as he traced the words with one finger. He remembered that evening as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Her name was Clara. She loved the sea as much as he did. Every afternoon they walked together along the cliffs, collecting smooth white shells while watching fishing boats return home beneath the orange evening sky. Clara always believed every lighthouse carried two lights. One that guided ships, and another that guided hearts. Before leaving on a voyage across the ocean with her father, she had stood beneath the lighthouse. The stars had just begun to appear. She had placed a small silver compass into Elias's hand. "If the light is still here," she whispered, "I'll always know the way home." He promised. No matter how many days passed, no matter how many years, the light would never disappear. The ship left the following morning. Weeks became months. Months became years. Then came the terrible storm. It was the strongest storm anyone in the village had ever seen. Towering waves swallowed the harbor. The wind screamed through the cliffs. When the storm finally ended, Clara's ship never returned. Many believed it had been lost forever. The village held a quiet memorial. Flowers were placed beside the sea. Families mourned. Life slowly continued. But Elias never accepted that the story had ended. A promise was still a promise. Every sunset, he climbed the tower. Every night, he lit the great beacon. Not because anyone expected him to, but because somewhere in his heart, he believed hope deserved a light. Outside, the wind became softer. The moon climbed higher into the sky, painting a silver path across the calm water. Elias stepped onto the narrow balcony surrounding the lantern room. He looked toward the endless horizon. The silver compass still rested safely inside his coat pocket. He touched it gently. For the first time in many years, the tiny compass needle trembled. Only once. Then it became still again. Elias frowned. The old compass had never moved strangely before. He lifted his eyes toward the sea. Far away. So far that it was almost impossible to see. A single golden light flickered once upon the horizon, then disappeared. The old keeper did not speak. He simply smiled. Very quietly, he whispered into the night, "You're still out there." The waves answered only with their peaceful song. And somewhere beyond the endless darkness, a forgotten journey had finally found its way back toward the lighthouse. Only Lighthouse Keeper Who Waited 40 Years Part 3, Where the Sea Keeps Every Promise. The night grew quieter with every passing hour. The fire in the small iron stove burned gently, filling the lighthouse with the warm amber glow. Outside, the wind had become so soft that it seemed afraid to disturb the sleeping sea. Elias remained on the narrow balcony, his hands resting lightly on the old stone railing. His eyes never left the horizon. Many people believed waiting was an empty thing. But Elias had learned something different. Waiting was not about counting the days. It was about choosing hope, again and again, even when the world had forgotten why. For 40 years, the seasons had visited the lighthouse like old friends. Spring had painted the cliffs with tiny white flowers. Summer had filled the air with the scent of salt and warm grass. Autumn had carried golden leaves across the rocky paths. Winter had wrapped the tower in frost so delicate it sparkled beneath the morning sun. Everything had changed. Everything. Except the light. Sometimes Elias wondered if the lighthouse was keeping him alive, or if he was keeping the lighthouse alive. Perhaps neither could exist without the other. He smiled softly at the thought. Far below, the waves whispered against the rocks. Every wave arrived. Every wave returned. None of them hurried. The sea had all the time in the world. Perhaps that was why it understood promises better than people did. People often believed that time erased love. The sea believed something else. The sea believed love simply became quieter, like a melody carried beneath the surface. Still there, even when no one could hear it. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear Clara laughing. Not as a memory, not as a dream, but as if the wind itself had borrowed her voice. He remembered the evenings they had spent sitting on these very cliffs. She would ask impossible questions. If every star disappeared, she once asked, would the lighthouse still know where to shine? Elias had laughed. The lighthouse doesn't follow the stars. What does it follow? It follows its purpose. Clara smiled. I hope people can do that too. Those words had stayed with him for 40 years. Purpose. Not certainty. Not reward. Just purpose. That was enough. The silver compass rested quietly in his pocket. He took it out once more. Its surface was scratched from age. The tiny glass covering the needle was no longer perfect. Yet somehow, it still felt warm, as though another hand had touched it only moments before. The needle moved again. Not wildly, only gently. It pointed toward the open sea. Then, it stopped. At that same moment, far beyond the reach of ordinary sight, a single lantern appeared. Small, golden, steady. It did not sway like the light of a fishing boat. It moved slowly, calmly, almost as though it already knew the way. Elias felt no fear, only peace. Some journeys, he thought, take exactly as long as they are meant to. The lighthouse beam swept across the ocean once again. This time, for the briefest heartbeat, the distant lantern answered. One flash, then another. Like two old friends recognizing each other after a lifetime apart. Elias placed one hand over his heart. He whispered so quietly that even the wind could barely hear him. I kept the light burning. The ocean answered with another gentle wave. Above him, the stars shone brighter than ever before. Below him, the sea carried a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. And somewhere between those two endless worlds, hope was no longer waiting. It was finally finding its way home. #The Lonely Lighthouse Keeper Who Waited 40 Years Part 4. The ship beyond the mist. The first light of dawn was still many hours away. The sea remained wrapped in silver moonlight, calm and endless, as though the world itself had fallen asleep. Elias did not leave the balcony. His eyes rested on the tiny golden light far beyond the horizon. It was still there, steady, patient, almost breathing with the rhythm of the ocean. He had imagined many things during 40 years of waiting. Sometimes he thought he heard distant bells. Sometimes he believed he saw sails hidden inside the morning mist. Yet every time, the sea returned to silence. Tonight felt different. Not because he expected a miracle, but because, for the first time in decades, his heart felt strangely light. He no longer wondered whether Clara would return. Instead, he found himself grateful that he had kept his promise. A promise, he had learned, was never measured by its ending. It was measured by the love with which it was kept. The old keeper slowly descended the spiral staircase. Each wooden step creaked softly beneath his boots. On the first floor stood a small oak chest. Inside it were the few treasures of his long life. A faded blue scarf, a pressed white flower, several smooth seashells collected many summers ago. And beneath them, a bundle of letters tied together with a pale ribbon. None of the letters had ever been sent. Every year, on the same spring evening, Elias had written one. He told Clara about the changing seasons, about the young fishermen who had become grandfathers, About children laughing on the beach. About the birds that nested beside the lighthouse every spring. About sunsets so beautiful that words could barely hold them. He had written everything, as though she would read every letter one day. He untied the ribbon. The paper had grown soft with age. He opened the very first letter. The ink had faded slightly. Yet one sentence remained perfectly clear. As long as this light shines, you will never be forgotten. Elias closed his eyes. A peaceful smile touched his face. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its endless circle. Across the sea, across the years, across every memory that refused to disappear. Then, from somewhere below the cliffs, a sound reached the lighthouse. Not loud, not frightening, only gentle. The slow ringing of a ship's bell. Once. Then silence. Elias looked toward the window. The bell rang again. This time it sounded closer. Very slowly. He opened the heavy wooden door. Cool ocean air filled the room. The moonlight stretched across the narrow path leading down to the shore. There, far below, hidden within a blanket of soft white mist, a ship had appeared. Its sails were untouched by the wind. Its lanterns glowed with warm golden light. It moved without hurry, as though time itself had slowed to welcome it home. Elias did not speak. He simply placed one hand over the silver compass in his pocket. For 40 years, he had believed he was waiting for someone. But now, watching the quiet ship glide across the sleeping sea, he realized something far more beautiful. Hope had never asked him to wait forever. Hope had only asked him to keep the light burning. And tonight, the sea had come to thank him. The Lonely Lighthouse Keeper Who Waited 40 Years Part 5. The captain's last message. The mist drifted slowly across the water, soft as silk. The mysterious ship came no closer than the edge of the bay. It simply rested there, floating quietly beneath the stars. Its lanterns glowed with the same warm golden color as the lighthouse above. For a long moment, nothing happened. The sea breathed. The lighthouse turned. The stars watched in silence. Elias walked carefully down the narrow stone path that led toward the small wooden pier below the cliffs. Every step echoed gently in the stillness of the night. He felt neither excitement nor fear, only a quiet curiosity. As he reached the end of the pier, the ship's bell rang once more. One clear note. Then silence returned. No voices came from the ship. No footsteps crossed its deck. No sails moved in the wind. It seemed less like a vessel, and more like a memory carried gently across the sea. A small wooden boat slowly drifted away from the larger ship. No one was rowing it. The calm tide guided it naturally toward the pier. Inside the boat rested only one object. A weathered wooden box. Nothing else. Elias waited patiently until the little boat touched the pier with the softest sound. He lifted the box into his arms. It was surprisingly light. The wood had become smooth after many years upon the sea. A tiny brass lock held the lid closed. But time had already broken it. He opened the box slowly. Inside lay a folded piece of cloth. The blue scarf. The one Clara had worn on the morning she left. Beneath it rested a small leather journal. And under the journal, a single envelope. On the front, written in careful handwriting, were only 4 words. For Elias, if found, asterisk, asterisk. His hands trembled very gently. Not from age, but from the weight of a moment he had carried inside his heart for 40 years. He unfolded the letter. The paper had grown fragile with time. The ink was faded, yet every word remained clear enough to read beneath the moonlight. The letter was not written by Clara. It was written by the captain of the ship. Greater than, dear Elias, greater than if this letter has reached you, then many years have already passed. Greater than we met a terrible storm far from home. Greater than we fought the sea with all our strength. Greater than Clara was brave until the very end. Greater than before the waves separated us. She looked toward the distant horizon. Lighthouse keeper who waited 40 years. Final chapter. The light never belongs to one person. Autumn arrived quietly. The cliffs turned shades of gold and amber. The sea became cooler. And each morning a gentle mist drifted across the water before disappearing beneath the rising sun. Life continued, just as it always had. Fishing boats still left before dawn. Children still laughed along the shoreline. The lighthouse still sent its warm beam across the sea every evening. But something inside Elias had changed. For the first time in 40 years, he no longer looked toward the horizon expecting someone to return. His waiting had become peace. One afternoon, a young sailor named Thomas climbed the winding path to the lighthouse. He had recently been asked by the village to learn how to care for the old beacon. Elias welcomed him with a warm smile and a cup of tea. For many weeks they worked side by side. Thomas learned how to polish the great crystal lens until it shone like sunlight. He learned how to trim the lamp, how to listen to the changing wind, how to read the clouds before a storm arrived. And most importantly, he learned that a lighthouse was more than stone, glass, and light. It is a promise, Elias told him one quiet evening. A promise to strangers you'll never meet. Thomas never forgot those words. As winter approached, Elias grew weaker. He climbed the spiral stairs more slowly than before. His hands trembled a little when he lit the lamp. Yet every evening, the beacon still came alive. Its warm light continued its endless journey across the sea. Then one peaceful night, the sky became clearer than Elias had ever seen. Millions of stars stretched across the heavens. The ocean reflected them so perfectly that it seemed as though the lighthouse stood between 2 skies. Elias climbed the tower one final time. He polished the glass carefully. He lit the great lantern. He watched its golden light sweep across the sleeping sea. Once, twice, again. He smiled, not with sadness, but with quiet gratitude. He thought of Clara, not as someone who had been lost, but as someone who had taught him that love could become a light for others. He thought of the captain, of the fishermen, of the children who had grown old beneath the faithful beam. He thought of every unknown sailor who had safely reached home because this light had never gone out. The lighthouse had never asked for applause. The sea had never asked for thanks. Both had simply continued doing what they were meant to do. Perhaps that was the secret to a meaningful life. Not to be remembered by everyone, but to quietly make someone else's journey a little safer. The cold night breeze drifted through the open window. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. He listened. The waves, the wind, the distant cry of a seabird. Everything sounded exactly as it had 40 years before. And somehow, that felt beautiful. Below, Thomas noticed the lantern had stopped moving. He climbed the spiral staircase quickly but quietly. When he reached the top, he found Elias sitting peacefully beside the great light. A gentle smile rested upon the old keeper's face. One hand still held the little silver compass. It pointed not toward the sea, but toward the glowing lantern. Thomas understood, without speaking. He gently placed his hand upon the old keeper's shoulder. Then he turned to the great beacon. The light continued its slow circle across the ocean. Outside, the waves kept rolling toward the shore. The stars continued shining above. Morning slowly painted the eastern sky with soft shades of blue and gold. Years passed. Travelers who crossed those waters often spoke of the lighthouse on the lonely cliff. Some knew the name of the village. Very few remembered the name Elias. But that never mattered, because every sailor remembered the light. And sometimes, that is how the kindest people remain in the world. Not through statues, not through fame, but through the quiet goodness they leave behind. So if you ever find yourself walking beside the sea on a peaceful night, and you notice a warm golden light turning slowly across the waves, pause for a moment. Take a gentle breath. And remember, even the smallest light can guide someone safely through the darkest night. Now the lighthouse is shining. The sea is calm. The stars are watching. There is nothing left to worry about. Nothing left to carry. Only the peaceful sound of the waves, the warm glow of the lantern, and the quiet comfort of knowing that somewhere, a light is always waiting. Good night.